Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Esther Aliva from Navozyme. At Navozyme, we have developed cutting-edge technology solutions for key maritime certification processes related to port clearance, seafarers training certifications, bunkering operations, and ship registry to transform the maritime industry, enhance lives, and to accelerate decarbonization. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first webinar in a new decarbonization series, BOUNCE. We launched BOUNCE today with the idea to bring to you the latest trends from the hand of industry experts. On today's session, titled Dynamic Decisions Pivot and Bounce Towards Decarbonization, we are privileged to have Dr. Ricardo Barcelona, an expert on energy and investment decisions and author of the book Dynamic Decisions, which will come out in August here in Europe. In today's session, we will cover some of the topics from the book regarding how managers can create the most profitable niches today while pivoting towards decarbonization. Dr. Ricardo Barcelona will share his insights in a conversation with Anjaney Borwankar, Navozyme's co-founder and chief executive. Now, without further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Ricardo Barcelona and Anjaney Borwankar. The floor is yours, Anjaney.
Thank you, Esther. Thanks a lot. Ricardo, are you there? You can also join in and switch on your video, please.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Ricardo. Very nice to see you. So after that brief but important introduction, I don't want to spend more time on introducing Navozyme, etc. All I can say is I'm super excited to begin the second half of this year with the focus on a very important aspect of today's life, which is decarbonization. And we'll see why that's important. I think for those who are, maybe not as familiar as to what is going on with the energy transition, what is the impact that it has on the lives of everyone. And for those who are business professionals, and I think in this group today, we have an international audience. I looked at the registrations. There are people really signed up from all corners of the world, if I may say so, right from Australia, US, Asia, Philippines, and of course, in Europe, where Ricardo and I both are currently located. And it's a very warm summer, but today is a special occasion, which is why I've also put on my jacket. So Ricardo, very nice to have you. I'll briefly introduce you to the audience in case they're not familiar with the work you've done in this field. And then we'll have a conversation. I'll ask you a few questions, especially focused on the new book, which is coming out in August. I understand it's already available for pre-orders. So maybe people will get inspired after listening to this. And I certainly have, thanks for sharing the teaser, the few pages of the book, and really each line, each word is very impactful. So congratulations on that. And let me introduce, for the sake of the audience, very briefly, allow me a couple of minutes to just highlight some of Dr. Ricardo Barcelona. I'll call him Ricardo in this webinar. And I know him already for many years, in fact, for a few decades now. So we have a very good relationship. And I hope you will allow me to ask some probing questions as well, Ricardo. I hope that's okay for you.
No problem.
Excellent. Also, knowing your candid style, I think this is going to be very, useful for the audience. Okay, so I'm not going to read all your CV. It'll really take the entire time. But you've actually played many roles in your career. You started out as a senior executive with Shell PLC, worked internationally, including in their headquarters in Netherlands some time back. You worked as an investment banker. You have not just any investment banker, you were actually one of the top rated analysts and very well known for your recommendations. So you've written already another book. Before that, of course, you completed a PhD from King's College London, so quite a prestigious place there. And then your new book that's coming out is your second book. So you've had a previous book where you focused also on how leaders, managers can look at taking decisions, but more in an analytical way. So that book kind of led to the understanding that business like models, NPV, all those analyses are important, but they are not prescriptions for taking a decision. So I think you changed the mindset of a lot of people thanks to that book. This new book, Dynamic Decisions, that we're going to talk a lot about, I'm curious to know what insights you want to share with everyone. But let me begin by asking you a question, which is quite obvious, but quite important to set the framework here. And that question is, why is this energy transition important for all of us?
Okay, I think let's go straight for the jugular. Yeah? When we talk about energy investments or energy transitions, nowadays, I think we're talking about trillions of dollars as the investment needed in 1 year. Yeah, 30 years ago, when this conversation started, we talk about $8 trillion in a decade. So first, there's a scale effect. There's a pacing of the investment, which clearly is getting to be a lot quicker. So what has changed with regards to energy transitions as known 30 years ago and as how we understand it today? 30 years ago, we talk about transitioning from one energy source to another. So in other words, we're shifting. If we go back probably about 100, 150 years ago, we're seeing a shift from biomass, including organic waste, yeah, as the output of that process, into something that is mechanical in nature. Yeah. So I think the first transition is from animal power to mechanical power. Yeah. So it goes from horses to coal to the rise of internal combustion engines. It was replaced with oil, and oil was then replaced by gas, was replaced by nuclear, and in between you have hydro and a few other sources of energy. Yeah. And that essentially what energy transition comprised. So it was very technologically driven. It was driven by the supply mix. But nowadays, when we talk about energy transition, we have to incorporate as well whether that transition or that shift in the preference for certain types of energy is also leading to an equitable distribution of benefits. Yeah, so I think this is more complicated. Yeah, and not only should it be equitable, it has to be sustainable. Yeah, so before you know it, you're no longer talking about technology. You're talking about human beings. You're talking about the human persons. So this brings me back to the point you've raised, Anjan, about decision making is about human beings. It's not about the financial model spewing out the results and say, okay, if NPV is positive, let's go ahead and invest. Yeah, but I think nowadays the change in the mindset has to be, after we have done all the analysis that we need to do, the relevant question is, so what? What does it mean to us? Yeah.
Fantastic. So you've answered the so what in terms of why is the energy transition important. You've also given us a very brief historical perspective. So I was looking at the book, and you've got some heavyweights who have recommended this book. You know, you have a foreword from the dean of IESC Business School, Franz Eukamp, and it's really well written with also mentioning the energy transition, the historic perspective. So for our younger audience who may be listening, they may not be aware, but just like today we have the CO2 crisis or the melting of ice crisis, not that many decades ago, we had the horse manure crisis, right? So
That's right.
as we were making the transition from animal to others, animal power, horsepower, which is still used today, to show the engine capacity, engine power. There were actually a lot of horses, and of course they're animals, so they poop. And then the entire city is full of poop. So imagine you're walking around in in animal poop. So this is not a joke, right? This is something that, depending on what pivot we do with our energy, at the end it has consequences, especially when it scales up. So this is what you're trying to say, and we've hopefully learned some lessons. We'll see whether that's true or not. So thanks for giving that perspective right up front. Now your book is divided into 4 sections. There is the first section, which what we are talking about, understanding the energy pivot, as you call it. Then you have a section called adaptive moves. Then we are looking at, what are the strategies to win, or you call it bounce to win. And for those of you who think that there is a spelling mistake or a typo, no, it's particularly written in that particular way. We'll unravel that mystery later, why bounce is written in the way with the N in small letters. We'll talk about that later also if we get a chance. And then finally, your 4th section is really about winning strategies. So how can you actually be profitable by looking at this not just as a problem, but really as an opportunity that can bring you lots of benefits, right? So you take a very optimistic outlook also in this book. And I want to also tell the readers that the book has a lot of content, which we won't be able to cover in this one webinar. So what we agreed, and gratefully you have agreed here, Ricardo, we'll actually do this as a 2-part series. So this is part 1 of the series. Second part will be actually in a month's time at the end of August, and we'll again have the registration for you. So in this one, we'll actually be able to focus on understanding the energy pivot and what are those adaptive moves that you suggest, right? So we'll focus on the first 2 sections of the book. And then in the second one, we'll probably look at winning strategies, right?
Yeah.
So tell us, what is this dynamic decisions? Why have you named the book Dynamic Decisions? And what are you exactly referring to here?
Okay. Yeah, so when I started writing about dynamic decisions, a number of thoughts came to mind. The first thing is, if generations and generations of managers have been formed in the best universities, the best business schools around, then why is it that there's one lingering problem that we don't seem to be able to tackle? If investing in something is as simple as punching a few numbers into a spreadsheet, come up with a positive NPV, we write a check, put in the money in the bank, disperse it, and things should work out, hopefully, in a very nice way according to plan. Unfortunately, we also illustrate by experience that in a lot of cases, most of these investment evaluations do not work out according to plan. And the simple reason is because the markets are dynamic, the markets are uncertain, the type of competition that we deal with requires us to understand the context of that decision. So I think the short way of describing dynamic decisions is to imagine the difference between how a woodcutter would react and how a general would look at a battlefield. Well, when I talk about NPV and the conventional capital budgeting approach, I would refer to that mode of thinking as a thinking of a woodcutter. So how would a woodcutter think? I'm given a target. I'll say I need 100 tons of wood that I need to chop. I go to forest, start chopping the trees, start chopping, piling up the wood. And the quicker that I do, the quicker that I get the job done, which means I'm very efficient in getting it done, then the better the returns will be. But the assumption is, and those assumptions are fatal to the real world, where real people reside in a real market, yeah, which is there are other people who would be claiming, who would be claimants to the forest. There would be others who would probably be in the way to try to frustrate a manager from achieving what they have set out to do. Yeah. And most importantly, the consequence of it is that not all the wood that you chop, you would be able to sell. Yeah. And it could be for many, many other reasons. Yeah. I think the pandemic has, the Ukrainian war with Russia is a good example of that. Yeah. You have logistics falling apart. So you might be able to chop a lot of wood, but you cannot deliver it to the market. Yeah. So the difference with a general is that the general would look at the battlefield and say, if I want to compete and fight or mow down an army that is opposing my efforts, I do not assume that that army will stand still and do nothing. I would rather look at how that army or the opposing general would actually react and respond. And that interaction would lead to a very interesting battle. Yeah. In some cases, you would probably extend your hand of collaboration. In some cases, you would just simply decide, well, the odds are probably in your favor, or negotiation fails. So the option of collaborating is off the table. Yeah. So at the end of the day, in that very dynamic interactions of two opposing armies, you need to have flexibility. Yeah. And that flexibility comes in the form of, if your action of investing could lead to adverse consequences, and if you have the flexibility to reverse the decision by postponing your investment or delaying that investment to another date, then you avoid making a loss. And surely that kind of flexibility would have a value. And that flexibility, unfortunately, is not available in a conventional capital budgeting approach. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that analogy would probably describe what's the difference between a dynamic decision operating under managerial flexibility versus the conventional approach that capital budgeting is prescribing. Yeah. Yes,
Understood. Thanks for explaining that. So I think this incorporates a lot of stuff that is going on today in the context that we live in. The term VUCA was coined quite some time back, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And I think we are promoting that it's not just VUCA, but it's also got a double D there. And the 2D stands for digitalization as well as decarbonization, right? So you have to actually think of these two as intrinsic to the context that we live in. And this context is continuously changing in terms of industry dynamics, changing in terms of policy making, which you refer to. And dynamic decisions is really looking at how do you take decisions under this context, right? So it's a very powerful book in the sense that it takes reality into consideration. It's not just an academic insight, but it's actually something very practical as well. So just leading on from this, before we dive a little deeper, I want to also understand your tagline for the book, if I may say so, is energy pivot, which we've kind of touched upon a little bit. adaptive moves and winning bounce with BOU in capitals and CE in capitals, right? So can you elaborate on that tagline also?
Yeah, great. So let me pick up on the VUCADD,
Okay.
as a starting point.
Would you like also to have that chart with the structure that you have in the book, the first chart there, shown to the audience, because that may help them also, follow this conversation.
Yes. I think that would help.
Okay, great. So you have that, I think, now.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, we can see that.
So if we start talking about VUCA, we're just scanning the environment. And I think many excellent work has been done on what VUCA is all about. Yeah. What's probably needed as far as a manager is concerned, after reading all this excellent work that has been published, is to say, well, okay, now you tell me that the world is volatile. I already know that. You tell me that I'm making decisions on the basis of uncertain markets. Yes, I already know that. Well, consequences, it makes my life complex. Yes, I already know that. Yeah. And then whatever I do would lead to something which is ambiguous, which means unlike NPV or IRR, my environment does not depend on a number that says it's a positive number, I go ahead, but rather it's ambiguous. It could be negative, it could be a big number, it could be a small number. And if it's a big number, it does make a difference, and I want to understand why it's a big number. I mean, it's a small number, I want to understand why it is a small number and why I don't need to worry about it. Or maybe I'm wrong about it and underestimated the magnitude of the effects. Yeah, so this is where dynamic decisions pick up from where VUCA left off. Yeah. So we first need to know what we're dealing with. Yeah. When we need to know what we're dealing with, that gives you the two contexts for that knowledge. One is what you're doing, what you're dealing with as a firm. And in chapter 2, you're talking about what the policymaker is doing. Yeah. Because what's important about the policymaker's actions is if a policymaker wants to impose a tax on renewable energy, or rather on fossil fuel, then it may favor some renewable energy. Yeah. So that means the action of the policymaker is not something which is isolated from the life of a manager. In fact, it's something you need to know about. Yeah. The adaptive moves then become a question of the framing of the problem that you're trying to deal with. Yeah. So oftentimes we talk about this is the strategy that we want to pursue, and because the strategy that we want to pursue is based on certain knowledge that we assume is already known, as is going to be the case going forward, yeah, then it becomes a straight line approach to problem solving. Yeah, and a straight line approach to problem solving is say, know the problem, know the alternatives, and these are the solutions, and pick the solutions that best gives you the outcome. And the problem with that is we say, well, what happens if the assumptions turn out to be wrong or the markets has changed? Because as it so happens, you're not dealing with a tree, just like a woodcutter, but you're dealing with people who would actually respond or react. And these are people who may want to collaborate with you, wants to cooperate or support your actions, or these are people who may want to oppose you. Yeah. So the framing has to be done on the basis of understanding why you're doing the things you aim to do, and that is articulating a purpose. Yeah, so that gives us the first letter, yeah, in the pivot, which is P. Yeah. But in articulating a purpose, we need to inform that with our insights. Yeah, and our insights could be a function of what our own inclination is as a person, what our risk aversion is, or what our risk appetite is. Yeah. And comes the flexibility that we talk about managers changing decisions or changing course when the market conditions change. And that's a V, as in victory. Yeah. You veer away from situations which could give adverse consequences, or you veer away from a path of action that would actually lead to some losses. Yeah. And then you move into the O and the T, which is really just, this is where the operational aspect of the decision making, yeah, and knowing what you're really setting out to do based on the outlook that you have as a person, as an individual, as a business, then you take action to the risk. So that is the first part of the framing of a strategy. Yeah. Yeah. So this is where the calibration of the risk, the calibration of the opportunity could already be implemented on a pilot scale. Now, once you've experimented on some pilot projects, then you get additional information. Yeah. And once you know what works and what doesn't work, then that's where the next stage comes in. You can already scale up. You can already scale up the things that work. You can already inject some of the flexibility into the system. And that is where the bounce to win comes in. And I will not elaborate too much on the bounce to win because we can deal with that in a month's time. Yeah? Now, combining the framing and the scaling, yeah, this is the point where we start moving into the transformational aspect of the firm and society. And that is a time when managers actually act to reconfigure and to introduce the innovation that one would like to introduce. Yeah, so that brings us to the decarbonization and the digitalization opportunity that Anjan has mentioned about. Yeah. So why do we need to decarbonize? Well, we need to decarbonize for a simple reason that probably the process of converting energy from raw material into useful energy creates pollution. And pollution, whatever your belief is on climate change, yeah, pollution is something that we can agree is something that is not desirable. Yeah. Yeah. But the problem is with the carbon footprint is that very few of us are actually very conscious about the carbon footprint that each one of us is creating based on the actions that we make. Yeah. So for example, if we eat a piece of steak, yeah, does that create a carbon footprint? Well, probably it does. If you trace it back, you know, how the calf is grown and nurtured into a cow, and how the cow is slaughtered, and how the piece of steak is being transported from the slaughterhouse to the supermarket and to your dinner table, then I think you'd be able to trace that, yeah, as to how much carbon or CO2 is being emitted along the way. Now, I think with digitalization and the introduction of technology, from the blockchain technology, that becomes something doable, and not only doable, but something that could be made affordable. So if we have the feedback loop to tell us how much CO2 we're emitting with a number of actions that we're taking, then we are probably better informed to take actions. And the advantage of that is if we can get that information in real time, then we can change course. If action A leads to a higher carbon footprint, assuming that an action B or an action C is available to the managers to pivot into. So I think
Ricardo, that's fantastic. So here, may I ask you to maybe bring it from the 30,000 feet now to a practical examples. Now in your book, you take real life examples, So would you like to illustrate, some of the points that you've stressed upon through an example that you have studied, and then we can see whether that can be also applied to the maritime industry, which we are quite interested in. So maybe give us an example. Yeah. We can stop sharing the slide. Thank you.
No, so I think we can start with what Repsol is doing, or what Repsol has done over the last 10 years or so. Repsol, I think just as a background, Repsol is what I call one of the major European oil and gas company. So it has always been known for a number of things. One is, in Spanish terms, it's a dominant player. In European terms, it's a medium-sized company. A few years back, I think Repsol was in a headline because of two things. First, it acquired Gas Natural, which is now called Naturgy. It's a gas and power utility, which is a major player in Spain and in some parts of Europe and Latin America. The other reason Repsol was in the headline was Argentina decided to sequester or renationalize the Argentine business of Repsol. So that means 1/2 of the oil and gas business of Repsol just went back into the national or state sector in Argentina. And in exchange for that, just to fast track the conversation, Repsol got $6 billion. Now, so that's where Repsol started a few years ago. Question to the CEO of Repsol. With a lot of cash and with your view about being one of the earliest proponents of taking advantage of a low carbon energy transition by 2030, what are you going to do differently from your competitors? And this is what Repsol did. Okay, with the $6 billion in cash, which is a welcome boost to the treasury of the company, they started repurposing the business. And how did they repurpose the business? They started acquiring gas assets in the developed countries, in the developed markets. So you've really shifted the risk profile of Repsol from being an emerging market plus a developed market kind of risk profile into something which is more focused into Europe and high growth Asian markets. The second aspect of that is to say Repsol started to build a service component to provide energy services to their consumers. Now, so along that conversation, I just raised a question. I said, so if you believe that the future is going to be more electricity and less oil, and probably gas in between, yeah, then why don't you go back and reintegrate yourself more fully with a former affiliate of the company called Gas Natural? Yeah, because by combining an incumbent power and gas utility who is dominant in their marketplace and also a dominant oil and gas operation in their field, you've actually cut short the integration of a powerhouse. Well, literally a powerhouse. Yeah, a company that is strong in the fuel side and a company that is strong in the provision of electricity. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the response of Repsol. The response of Repsol is that yes, Naturgy is a very good company. In fact, it is an excellent company that is well run. Yeah. But if we have to transition and probably start repurposing the legacy businesses of a power and gas utility, and at the same time also repurpose the legacy positions of an oil and gas company, then that would probably distract us from the real purpose of taking advantage of the emerging opportunities, which is really taking care of the consumers' needs and their customers' needs of transitioning into a low carbon energy supplies. Yeah. So I said, so what exactly do you mean by providing energy services? Yeah. I said, well, the energy services that we're going to provide is the following. Yeah. So let's just imagine we have a major factory, let's say a chemical factory. The core business of a chemical company is not to produce electricity, is not to supply energy to the factory, but rather to be able to access affordable, competitive, and reliable energy when it is needed. Yeah, and this is where a company like Repsol could step in and say, okay, we can take that off your back. Yeah, and that becomes something that you can outsource to us. So Repsol can basically, with their knowledge and their competence in energy management, could basically source the different supplies that are coming from renewable sources or from low carbon sources, provided to the chemical plant, and the chemical plant can concentrate on producing chemical, yeah, effectively, competitively, and affordably. Yeah, yeah. So I think that combination gives you a real basis for cooperating between two companies where in a real partnership, yeah, as opposed to just simply a transactional basis where one buys from the other. Well, let's say the chemical company buying from Repsol the power that they need as a supplier. Yeah, so that is, I think, the difference between the two model of a utility.
Okay, so that was an example of a very large oil and gas company. Repsol is very known in at least the region here, and you've kind of shown how they consider the energy pivot decision here, right? And how also the changing policy. So here, the case of Argentina, basically taking over their assets, right? So how that, which is a big problem, they use that as an opportunity to really make that energy transition. Great. So here, time just flies. I just looked at the clock and we've got about 5 minutes, So again, for the audience, any questions that you may have, feel free to, type that into the Q&A section, and I'll try to pick up on 1 or 2 questions, okay? Now, earlier, the people who registered, some of them actually made comments, and a question came to me directly also about, implications of this energy transition, this pivot for the maritime industry. So I'm going to rephrase that for you, in the sense that what would you say as a decision maker in the maritime industry? I know we have to wait for the second webinar for the tips on, what are the winning strategies, but can you let out the cat from the bag, at least a little bit, in terms of, give us 1 or 2 tips as decision makers in the maritime industry as we consider our strategies for decarbonization? What kind of practical pointers would you suggest?
Yeah, I think one of the areas that the energy industry, or any industries for that matter, could learn from the maritime industry is in the use of digital technology. Yeah, so I think you, as Navozyme, has done some, well, not only some work, but rather extensive work in how to capture the information from one port to another. Yeah, combine that in one place. Yeah, and you can come up with digital certificates of how much, let's say, how much waste is being disposed or discharged in one port to certify that the ship is ready for the next voyage. Yeah, so the same kind of technology could be applied, let's say, to, well, let's just talk about, continue just for a second on what Repsol did, let's say, or what Repsol can do with the chemical customer that they have. Yeah. So for example, if they have the digital technology, and by the way, Repsol is actually investing heavily on digitalization of their energy services. Yeah. So if Repsol knows in real time how much energy is being used by factory A, factory B, factory C, then it can actually create a portfolio of supplies, yeah, that they can offer to the chemical factory as an entity. Yeah, so they say, okay, well, if factory A tends to consume a lot of electricity at, let's say, 8 to 12 in the morning, and factory C, which is located in another area, tends to produce at nighttime, then you can probably take advantage, yeah, of the timing of the deployment of certain types of technology or supplies. Yeah. So probably for those who are producing more or using more energy at night, you can probably supply them with wind. And for those who are probably using more energy at midday, when the sun is shining, you can probably tap into the solar power supplies that are available in the marketplace. Yes. Well, the other thing, of course, is if you have real-time feedback, let's say in a household or in a number of buildings where you can aggregate the supplies, then you can already start to tailor-make the offering to the consumers of certain types of energy packages. Yeah, so you say, okay, well, it looks like that, you simply use energy at certain blocks of time in the day. Yeah. So if we can have your profile of your consumption, then we can probably tailor-make a package for you and say, well, okay, Anjan, you tend to cook at 11 to 12, while others are probably cooking at 1 o'clock to serve at the meal at 2 o'clock. Then we can take advantage of breaking that demand into certain smaller packages. Yeah. So that would have an impact on how you price your services and how you price the commodity that you're selling. Yeah. So I think those are examples of the use of digital technologies. Yeah. And probably, just to round it off, if you can connect that to your credit and collection, then you can actually give an hourly or even a daily summary of saying, well, this is actually what you consume. And now if we're conscious of what we're consuming on a daily basis, then we say, okay, we better stop consuming too much energy at this particular time of day when it's a peak pricing for the system.
Right. So, Ricardo, again, there's a lot to unpack in the last half an hour that you've spoken. I'm going to try and attempt to, at least eke out some of the learnings for me through this conversation, right? And with that, then maybe we can close. And if any question comes in, we can try to address that, either via email or through the next edition that we'll have in a month's time. So here in this conversation with Dr. Ricardo Barcelona, what we have focused on is really some of the learnings from his book on dynamic decisions. The whole point here is really about the decision context is important, which is ever changing. Not just is it a VUCA word, but there's also now the digitization and the decarbonization element, which needs to be taken into every decision making. We are talking of energy pivots. We focused a lot on that. We saw the historical context of how energy has shifted from animal power to the renewable sources that are there today. We have seen that this has many implications, and there are many ways to address that, right? So here you highlighted the policies that the government makes has an impact. Your competitors, other players in the industry, right? So the lens, the framework that you use for your decision making is quite important. And this book suggests a certain framework which can aid with taking those dynamic decisions. I think we still have to discuss things like, bounce to win. So once you finish some experiments, how do you actually capture the opportunity? What are those winning strategies? But we'll hold on to that for the next edition of the webinar, which is programmed already for the end of next month. And at the end, again, my colleague Esther will brief us about that and have a registration link. So I'd like to thank you, Ricardo, really for sharing your time, sharing your insights. And I'm sure it's an exciting time, with all these years of work being encapsulated in the book. Thanks also for having a short section, a short chapter from one of our advisory board members, Professor Giulia Toscani, and myself, writing about the example that you mentioned, where we are showing how we can, in a more real-time manner, measure some of the waste on board ships, right? Because the first step here is also knowing how much of the footprint is happening, right? So I think just the measurement aspect, and we are making a small contribution to that. I would say a tiny contribution, but thanks for also acknowledging and bringing that into your book. So any last comments before we close? And I'd like to also thank you for that, for your time in advance. Then after that, I'll pass it back to Esther for the closing remarks and for the registration link for the next webinar. So Ricardo, your final words before we close.
No, I think as a parting word, I think I would encourage you to add to your alphabet soup of strategy and investment decisions, pivot, which is purpose, insights, veer, which is your flexibility, overcome. If you have an obstacle, don't run away from it. Try to overcome it and find a way to overcome. Yeah. And that's how you create opportunities before you take actions to the risk. Yeah. Now, so BOUNCE as a bit of an intro for the next version is essentially connecting what we've learned from Pivot and say, if we're dealing with individuals and we're dealing with human beings as decision makers, then surely the belief system of an individual, which is your B, is important. Yeah, because chances are you're not going to do something against your belief unless you want to get into a schizophrenic or schizophrenia situation. Yeah. But your belief would influence your outlook and your understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. Yeah. And the next part of it would be for the financial economics that we already know. Financial analysis becomes relevant because through the financial analysis, we get into the small n, which is really the incentives for people to do things. Yeah. And the incentives is really answering the question of what is in it for the individual stakeholders. Yeah. Now, knowing all of this, we've done all the value calculations. We now know what the size of the pie is going to look like. Then we have a better chance of creating that pie and capturing that value, which is your C. And then you effect the actions to basically shift some of those advantages either in your favor as a business or in favor of the society that you serve, that you seek to serve. Yeah. And that completes the BOUNCE. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, it's a reframing of the whole question of the 3 R's that are quite common in sustainability discussions. I think if I remember correctly, the 3 R's used to stand for reuse, recycle, and Anjan, could you remind me what the 3rd R is?
Oh, that's a tough question now.
So reuse, recycle,
refurbish. I saw there's again, and other uses also for R's. So let's see if there are other uses here as well. But basically, it is reuse, recycle, and refurbish is sometimes used for recycle as well. Yeah.
Okay, so we can probably add another version of a 3 R into the alphabet soup and say you repurpose before you reframe, and once you reframe, that's a time you reconfigure. Yeah, how to meet your customers' needs as a business going forward. Yeah, and I think we can go into greater detail on how to apply our version of the 3 R's: repurpose, reframe, reconfigure. Okay.
Great. So on that quite a positive note and insightful note, we will close today's webinar again with the invitation for everyone to join the sequel, which will really focus on the winning strategies with examples of how to apply these frameworks into that. So in the next one, we'll have a quick recap of what we learned today. And then we'll jump into examples of how you can actually apply winning strategies. So please keep sending us your questions, comments, and I hope you also will join us in the next webinar. So thank you again, Ricardo. And with that, I pass it now to Esther for closing and for the registration link for the next one. So thank you again, Ricardo.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you everyone for connecting with us today. We hope you enjoyed the session, and you'll soon be receiving the link for the recording via email. Before we sign off, let me remind you that we'll come back on the 30th of August with the second session, Dynamic Decisions Part 2, to continue the conversation with Dr. Ricardo Barcelona. You can register now for the session and follow us on our LinkedIn page so that you don't miss any of our updates. We hope to see you again on our next webinar. So thank you. Bye.